The courthouse stood tall against the blistering afternoon sun, casting long shadows over the cracked pavement. Officer Michael Drayton's footsteps echoed down the corridor as he marched through the building, dragging a reluctant young man, Carlos Martinez, toward a small hearing room. His grip on the teenager's arm was tight, his face contorted with fury. The air was thick with tension, and a small group of bystanders whispered among themselves, muttering that Drayton had gone too far this time. Carlos, his wrists bound by cold cuffs, stood tall despite the injustice, his eyes locked with the curious onlookers, a defiant fire burning in them. His calm composure was a stark contrast to the boiling anger simmering within Drayton, who rattled off a series of charges with no real evidence. The officer accused Carlos of obstructing justice, disturbing the peace, and even threatening an officer. But Carlos knew, deep in his bones, this was nothing more than a baseless attack. Earlier that day, Carlos had been running errands in the neighborhood. A typical afternoon in the small town of Riverwood. He'd just picked up a prescription at the pharmacy when he saw a frail elderly woman frantically searching for her purse. She had dropped it near the entrance of a local grocery store, her hands shaking in panic. Without hesitation, Carlos stepped forward, his kindness prompting him to help. After a brief search, he found the woman's purse under a nearby bench and handed it back to her. She clutched it to her chest, whispering words of thanks as tears welled in her eyes. "You are a good man," she had said, her voice breaking. Carlos nodded, brushing off the praise. It was just who he was. His parents had taught him to always do the right thing, even when the world seemed indifferent. After helping the woman, he continued his walk toward the courthouse, unaware that fate was about to turn against him. As he reached the front steps of the courthouse, he noticed a scene unfolding in front of him. Officer Drayton, a large, imposing figure, was harassing a young black teenager near the entrance. The boy, barely able to meet the officer's cold gaze, was accused of loitering, even though the courthouse steps were open to the public. Something about the scene didn't sit right with Carlos. He approached, his voice steady but firm. "Excuse me, officer, is there a problem here?" Drayton spun around, his sneer evident. "Step aside, old man," he growled, gripping the teen's arm tighter. "You people always want to stick your noses where they don't belong." Carlos felt a flicker of anger, but he remained calm. "He's not doing anything wrong," he said, his words cutting through the tension in the air. Drayton's eyes hardened, his jaw clenching. Without warning, he yanked Carlos's arm, pulling him into the courthouse. The crowd gasped, some muttering in disbelief. But Carlos held his ground. His heart raced, but he focused on keeping his composure. He had nothing to hide, nothing but a desire to do what was right. As he was ushered into a small hearing room, the weight of what was happening sank in. The room was filled with murmurs from the bystanders and a few curious onlookers. But Carlos remained silent. He could feel the tension building, the room waiting for something to break. Drayton wasted no time in launching into his exaggerated accusations. Each charge was more ludicrous than the last. And Carlos stood there, listening, his anger simmering beneath the surface. He had expected this. The system had failed people like him for far too long. But he wasn't going to let it happen again. He would fight. The hum of murmurs filled the room as Officer Drayton paced back and forth, his anger palpable in the stifling air of the small courthouse hearing room. He was a man used to power, used to throwing his weight around, making people cower beneath his badge. But today, something felt different. Carlos Martinez stood before him, unwavering, his posture straight and his eyes locked on the officers. Drayton's voice cut through the silence again, his words laced with venom. This man, he spat, pointing toward Carlos, interfered with an ongoing investigation. I tried to do my job, but he decided to get involved in matters that didn't concern him. I have a right to keep the peace. And he thought he could just step in. Carlos remained calm, his hands clasped in front of him. His chest tightened, but he knew this wasn't the time to let emotion get the best of him. The truth was on his side, and he was about to make sure everyone in that room knew it. But it wasn't just about him. It was about every person who had ever been wronged by someone in power. Every person who had ever stood on the wrong side of an unjust system. The clerk behind the desk, an older woman with sharp, observant eyes, shot Carlos a sympathetic glance. She was used to seeing disputes unfold in this room, but she could tell something wasn't quite right about Drayton's version of events. The judge, a man in his 60s with glasses perched at the tip of his nose, watched silently from the bench, his expression unreadable. Carlos exhaled slowly, his mind racing, but he remained composed. He knew this wasn't just about clearing his name, it was about standing up for what was right. As the officer ranted on, he thought back to the incident on the courthouse steps. The teen who had been wrongfully accused. The elderly woman. The sense of injustice that had surged inside him. The judge, Judge Thomas Riley, adjusted his glasses and finally spoke. His voice slow and deliberate. Officer Drayton, I'm going to need you to be more specific. What exactly did Mr. Martinez do to obstruct your investigation? Drayton stopped pacing and shot the judge a withering look. I told you, he said, his voice dripping with disdain. He interfered when I was questioning a suspect. This man thinks he can just walk up and stop me from doing my job. He's got no business here. Carlos spoke up before the judge could respond. His voice steady but unwavering. Your Honor, I didn't stop him from doing his job. I simply tried to ensure that the officer wasn't overstepping his bounds. The young man he was harassing hadn't done anything wrong. And I wasn't going to stand by and watch an innocent person get mistreated. The judge's gaze shifted between Carlos and Drayton. He wasn't convinced by Drayton's story. But the wheels of the legal system turned slowly. We'll proceed with the hearing, Judge Riley said after a long pause. But I suggest we keep the accusations to facts, not personal attacks. Carlos clenched his fists in his lap, doing his best to suppress the anger that threatened to bubble up. He had seen this before, the games people in power played, using their influence to push their own narratives, to bend the truth to suit their needs. But he wasn't going to let that happen. Not today, not in this courtroom. A sudden knock on the door interrupted the tense silence that had fallen over the room. A young officer entered, holding a slim folder in his hands. He glanced at the judge, who motioned for him to come forward. Your Honor, the officer said, his voice tinged with urgency. There's something you need to see. Judge Riley's brow furrowed. What's this about? He asked, clearly irritated by the interruption. The officer handed the folder over to the judge, who opened it without a word. The room held its breath as the judge scanned the contents. His face remained stoic, but the faintest flicker of surprise passed through his eyes. I'll need a moment, Judge Riley said, tapping his gavel. We'll take a short recess. The room erupted into whispers as people tried to speculate what the new information might mean. Carlos, for a moment, felt a strange sense of unease. What was this new development? And what could it mean for the case? He stood there, trying to remain calm, but his heart was pounding. The stakes had just risen, and he wasn't sure if it was for better or worse. But one thing was certain, he wasn't going to back down. Not now, not ever. The recess seemed to stretch on forever. Carlos sat in the empty room, waiting, thinking about the long road that had brought him here. He had been fighting battles his whole life, against the unfairness of the world, against the biases that existed in every corner of society. But today, it felt like this was the moment when everything would change. The recess felt like an eternity to Carlos, though it was only a short 15 minutes. The minutes dragged on as he sat in silence, replaying everything that had happened so far. His mind was consumed with a mixture of anxiety, frustration, and a sense of purpose. He knew this was a pivotal moment in his life, in the fight for justice. But the uncertainty still gnawed at him. When the court doors finally opened, the air shifted, and the room seemed to buzz with a renewed energy. The judge entered first, followed by the young officer who had brought the folder. All eyes turned to Judge Riley as he took his seat at the bench, his expression still unreadable. "We'll reconvene," the judge announced, tapping his gavel. "Officer Drayton, Mr. Martinez, please take your places." Carlos stood, his legs stiff from sitting for so long. But he didn't let it show. He moved to the opposite side of the room, where the defense table sat. His gaze flickered to Drayton, who was standing with his arms folded, looking more self-assured than ever. Despite the tension that filled the room, the murmur slowly died down as Judge Riley motioned for the court to resume. The judge's voice was calm but carried a weight that demanded attention. "Officer Drayton, you've made some serious accusations against Mr. Martinez. But in light of new information, I must ask you again, do you stand by your claims?" Under oath? Drayton's smug grin faltered for just a split second before he quickly recovered. His eyes narrowed, and he lifted his chin, exuding false confidence. "Yes, Your Honor, I stand by everything I've said." The room held its breath, waiting for the judge's next move. Carlos, for a fleeting moment, felt his heart race. Could this be the moment he had been waiting for? Could this be the moment when the truth finally came to light? Judge Riley nodded, then looked at the officer who had delivered the folder. The officer stepped forward, handing the folder to the judge before retreating to the back of the room. Without a word, Judge Riley opened it, his eyes scanning the contents. For a long moment, the room was silent. No one dared to speak. No one dared to move. And then, finally, the judge cleared his throat. "I've received new information that changes everything," Judge Riley said, his voice steady but with a slight edge of surprise. "Mr. Martinez, you may proceed." Carlos took a deep breath. This was it. He had no idea what this new information was. But it felt like the tide was finally turning in his favor. He straightened his back, adjusted his tie, and began to speak. "Your Honor, members of the court," Carlos began, his voice steady but firm. "What Officer Drayton has accused me of is not only false but deeply unjust. I didn't obstruct any investigation. I simply stood up for what's right." The room was silent as Carlos's words hung in the air. He could feel the weight of the eyes on him, on the judge. The officers, the onlookers, the crowd seemed to be waiting for something monumental to happen. "I am a man of the law, Your Honor," Carlos continued. "I may not wear a badge, but I've spent my life fighting for what's right. I'm a prosecutor, and I oversee cases that deal with civil rights and police misconduct. I've seen firsthand how power can be abused. And that is exactly what happened here." The room gasped in unison. Eyes widened in disbelief. And for a moment, the world seemed to freeze. Carlos took a deliberate step forward, letting the truth of his words sink in. "I am the chief federal prosecutor for this district," he said, his voice unwavering, "and it is my job to ensure that justice is upheld, no matter who it is that stands in the way. Officer Drayton, you may not have known this, but I've spent my career fighting for the very rights you've trampled on today." The room was stunned into silence. Drayton's face drained of color, his arrogance slipping away in an instant. He stammered, trying to regain control of the situation. But it was too late. "I didn't know," Drayton muttered, his voice small, almost pleading. "I didn't know." Carlos didn't flinch. He wasn't here to feel sorry for Drayton. He wasn't here to offer him an ounce of sympathy. This wasn't about Drayton, it was about the people he had hurt, the lives he had damaged. It was about the injustice that had been allowed to fester unchecked for far too long. "You've accused me of obstructing justice," Carlos continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "But the only thing I've done today is stand up for it. You accused an innocent young man of loitering. You harassed him simply because of the color of his skin. And when I tried to stop you, you saw me as an obstacle. But I'm not an obstacle, Officer Drayton. I'm a reminder of the very justice you've sworn to protect." Drayton's jaw clenched, his eyes darting nervously around the room. But no one came to his defense. No one spoke up to support him. The weight of his actions was too much to ignore. Judge Riley's voice cut through the tension. "Officer Drayton, I believe you've made a grave error in judgment. And I will be requesting an immediate review of your conduct. This court does not tolerate such behavior." Carlos felt a sense of vindication wash over him. But it wasn't just about him. It was about the countless others who had been subjected to Drayton's abuse of power. It was about the system that, despite its flaws, had still managed to bring the truth to light. The judge turned his attention back to Carlos. "Mr. Martinez, the charges against you are hereby dismissed. You have the court's apologies for any inconvenience." A wave of relief swept over Carlos. He nodded, keeping his composure. But deep inside, there was a burning sense of justice. A sense that things had finally gone right. If only for this one day. The crowd in the room began to stir. Whispers of disbelief and admiration rippling through the spectators. A few began to clap softly, others nodding in respect. The elderly woman from earlier, the one he had helped find her purse, appeared in the doorway. She gave him a small, knowing smile as she caught his eye. Carlos walked out of the courtroom, a sense of peace settling over him. Outside, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting the courthouse in a soft golden glow. He had won today, and no matter how many battles lay ahead, he knew this victory was proof that the truth, no matter how long it took, could always come to light. Carlos stepped out of the courthouse, the warm evening air wrapping around him like a comforting embrace. The once ominous columns of the courthouse now seemed to stand a little taller, as if they had borne witness to something significant. The sun had begun to set, casting long shadows over the steps. But there was a quiet, almost serene feeling in the air. For the first time that day, Carlos allowed himself to breathe deeply, feeling the tension of the past few hours start to loosen. As he descended the steps, he couldn't help but glance around, noticing the faces in the crowd that had gathered. Some were still lingering by the doors, their voices hushed, but others had started to drift away. Whispers of the hearing, of the shocking revelation that Carlos was not only a man of law but a prosecutor, began to spread like wildfire. A few people who had been in the gallery during the trial came up to him, some offering handshakes, others just a nod of silent acknowledgement. Their respect was palpable, and Carlos knew it was more than just for the victory in the courtroom. It was for standing up against the very system that had allowed men like Officer Drayton to thrive unchecked for far too long. The elderly woman he had helped earlier that afternoon appeared at the base of the steps, a soft smile on her face. She approached him slowly, her frail hands gripping a small cane. and offered him a nod of approval. "You did good today," she said, her voice warm and full of gratitude. "The world needs more people like you." Carlos smiled at her, grateful for her kind words. "I was just doing what anyone else would have done," he replied modestly, though he knew deep down that it wasn't always the case. Not everyone would have stood up, especially in the face of such blatant abuse of power. The small crowd began to disperse, but Carlos's thoughts remained heavy on the day's events. The court had ruled in his favor, but the real fight was far from over. One victory wasn't enough to change a system that had been built on centuries of racial injustice and inequality. But this moment, this day, was a reminder of what could happen when the truth was allowed to come to light. It was a small crack in the wall, but every crack made the wall weaker. As Carlos walked away from the courthouse, he reflected on everything he had witnessed over the years. The injustices, the moments when he had stood in front of a judge or a jury, fighting to ensure that the marginalized voices were heard. But today felt different. He wasn't just an observer or an advocate, he had been part of something much larger. He had faced down a man who believed himself untouchable, who thought his badge gave him power over others. And today, Carlos had proven that even the most powerful could fall when their actions were laid bare. He walked slowly, taking in the sights of Riverwood, the small town that had been his home for so many years. It was a town full of good people, hardworking people who did their best to make a living, raise their families, and create a future for themselves. But there was also an undercurrent of fear and mistrust, of systems that had failed to protect those who needed it most. It was a town that needed change, but it was also a town that had the potential to be better. And Carlos was determined to make sure it would be. As he neared his car, he spotted a familiar face across the parking lot, a fellow prosecutor. Karen Turner. She was a colleague he had known for years, but their professional relationship had always been distant. Today, she crossed the lot quickly, her expression somber. "Carlos," she called, her voice low. "Can we talk?" Carlos nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly. He knew Karen well enough to know when something was weighing heavily on her mind. She wasn't one to seek attention, and her serious demeanor now made him wary. "Of course," he said, stepping over to meet her. "What's going on?" She glanced around before lowering her voice even further. "You did a good thing today. I know it wasn't easy, but you did the right thing." She paused, her eyes flickering with concern. "But you need to be careful. People aren't going to forget what you did today. And not everyone is going to be happy about it." Carlos's expression softened. He had heard the rumors over the years, the quiet whispers about those in positions of power who didn't want things to change. But he had always believed that doing the right thing was the most important thing. "I'm not worried about that," Carlos said, his voice resolute. "I've spent too many years seeing people suffer. I can't stand by anymore. And if that makes me a target, so be it." Karen looked at him for a long moment before nodding. "I admire your conviction," she said quietly, "but just know that standing up like you did today, it's going to cost you. The system doesn't like it when people disrupt its balance." Carlos knew she was right. The road ahead would be tough, and there would be more battles. But today, he had won, and that was enough, for now. As he got into his car, the weight of the day finally seemed to lift. But his mind was still racing. There was so much left to do. He thought about the young man who had been wrongly accused earlier. About the many people who had fallen victim to corrupt systems and people who thought their power made them untouchable. He thought about the fight for equality, for fairness, and for justice. The fight was far from over. But for today, Carlos felt like he had taken one step closer to making it right. With a deep breath, he started the engine and drove off into the evening, ready for whatever came next. Because he knew, deep down, that as long as he kept fighting, there was hope.